Welcome back to the Curdverse. I'm Lisa Kaywood, corporate functionary by day, home cheesemaker by night. Today we get to the long-promised episode with Josh Windsor, head of caves at Murray's Cheese, one of the largest purveyors of specialty cheeses in the United States. As I mentioned in the first episode of this season, there has been some wild talk about the imminent demise, supposedly, of white mold-covered or bloomy rind cheeses. Earlier this year, Josh took to the pages of Culture magazine to provide some nuance to those claims and explain why we don't actually have to fear. In this podcast today, we dive further into the details of why that is and what we have to look forward to as cheesemakers and consumers. At the end of the episode, we also get into a short discussion about blue molds, which are also facing similar, if less pressing, genetic pressures. So in the show notes for this episode, you will find a link to both Josh's piece in Culture magazine, as well as a discussion of the blue mold question by a team of microbiologists. So be sure to check out the show notes for this episode. And now here's Josh. Josh, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
It's great to have you on. So the topic that we're going to discuss today is the scandalous headlines that Camembert and Brie were in crisis and potentially going to go extinct. These came out in January. I ranted briefly about them on Twitter. You went on about them at much greater length and with more eloquence in the pages of Culture magazine. So I wanted to have you on to share your thoughts and eloquence in greater depth with listeners of the podcast. So thank you for joining us. Why don't we start by talking a little bit about kind of the news behind the rather salacious headlines, and then we can kind of dive into the details.
Certainly, yeah. So it's an interesting thing. The science behind the headlines has been around for. I mean, it's based upon a paper that was published in 2021 and a forthcoming paper as well. But basically, earlier this year, there was an announcement from the CNRS, which is a French science reporting center, that was talking about the decline in reproducibility of some of the microbes that we rely on for cheese production, in particular Penicillium roqueforti, which is most people know as the blue mold for blue mold cheeses, and Penicillium camemberti, which is responsible for all of our soft ripened white cheeses, which are predominantly, the Bries and Camemberts and their similar kin throughout the world. The science seems to be accurate and is pointing to that in certain populations of these two molds, the ability to reproduce is either dwindled or extinguished, which has impacts on the production of those cheeses. And since then, there's been a lot of interpretation of that these cheeses are going to disappear from the face of the planet and no longer exist, which is when I stepped in to kind of offer some alternative interpretations of what we know.
And so, what do we know? What are the alternative interpretations?
The phenomenon that's happening with both molds is kind of the same. That basically that these microbes, these fungi that we rely to age these cheeses, right? They lend their characteristic flavor and their characteristic textural profiles for them, have been used in cheese production for a very long time. And so we have, much like any relationship that we have with microbial species for food production, for fermentation, whether it be the yeast we're using for brewing or the sourdoughs that we have, that they change once we enter into this relationship. So they become domesticated. We feed them and we select amongst them for certain traits that produce the foods that we want. And in the case of Penicillium roqueforti, the blue molds, there's been a couple of lines of domestication. So there's still a lot of genetic diversity, not as much as you would find if it was just a wild species. Uh, and so there's one main branch that is kind of all of the lineages have come from that are used in the majority of cheese production in the world. And then there's one that is associated with the production of Roquefort, the classic blue cheese from France. And there's another one in this kind of like lesser known cheese called Tourmignon. And that one was just recently discovered to be its own branch on the evolutionary chain, which kind of spawned all of this conversation. It was that discovery that was like, hey, there's more genetic diversity in Penicillium roqueforti, a good thing since all these other branches are having trouble reproducing over time. With Penicillium camembert, it's a little more difficult because it seems, and we don't quite know for sure, but it seems like most of Penicillium camembert out in the world is descended from the same clone, the same branch on the evolutionary chain. And the way this mold gets entered into the cheese making process is it's purchased from a culture house, and it is added into the milk during the early stages of cheese making. And so there's a handful of culture houses in the world who produce these microbes for cheesemakers to use. And each one has their own set of strains and variations on this original ancestral mold. And it's not quite clear because, that's proprietary information. It's the lifeblood of their business. So they're not publishing the entire genome of the species that they're selling. So we don't quite know. Some culture houses have made statements that like we've tested our Penicillium camembert and we've found no genetic relationship between it and this ancestral species that was studied. But if it's true that the vast majority of camembert is descended from this one clonal lineage, and that clonal lineage is losing the robustness, the evolutionary fitness to reproduce, then we're not going to be able to continue using it to make this cheese. And so probably there's some strains out there that is going to be slower and some faster. It's going to narrow the availability of strains. So the price is going to go up. The available supply is going to go down. It's going to be harder to get cheeses like that. But that being said, it's not the only mold that we rely on to make these cheeses. And historically, like Penicillium camembert was isolated in the late 19th century and first identified. And it was a non-pigment forming, a white mold. It didn't get gray or blue or green or any of these other colors that we see on other cheese molds. And it had some characteristic mushroomy notes, and it had the things that we associate with these cheeses today. And so that was the one that people started using more and more and more because it kind of met the market demand of that. But that was a mold that was domesticated. It has an ancestor that was used in cheese production for many, many years. And even after camembert was isolated, you could still find lots of camemberts and Bries in cheese shops around the world that were like darker in pigmentation. They were a little more gray, a little more blue. They had a lot more earthiness in their aromas. If you look at like pictures of cheese shops from like the 50s and 60s, like Brie doesn't look anything like what we find for Brie today. It's a lot more variable in its colors, and we can assume that their aroma and the flavor and textures were more variable as well. So those are genetically diverse species and strains that are available, and still in cheese caves and aging facilities. But we have practices to keep them off the cheese in order to kind of favor this one strain of camembert. But it doesn't mean that we can't change that practice.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about that because the protocols that we have in place, some of them are as you say simple, just industry practices. Some of them are actually somewhat regulated. So what are the mechanisms here that the different levers that need to be pushed to start exploring some of those other lineages?
Yeah, so as Americans, we don't have a lot of regulation around what can and can't be called certain cheeses. There are like what we call standards of identity that are written into the Federal Code of Regulations, and those are around usually like what can and can't be called cheddar, what can and can't be called a Monterey Jack or Colby or Swiss cheese, but we don't have any around Camembert or Brie, which is why we call so many cheeses Brie and Camembert in the U.S., much to the chagrin of French-speaking people and people from France, where those cheeses are heavily regulated, through collective agencies that have a very strict codification of what can and can't be called those cheeses. They have in Camembert, what we call Camembert is kind of the degree of how closely they relate, but are somewhat similar to a cheese called Camembert de Normandy, which is, a PDO, a protected designation of origin cheese, which has a regulatory body that says to be called Camembert de Normandy, the cheese has to be made with milk that comes from this breed of cow in this particular region. These are the certain practices that we have in making it. And this is why, which really triggered the Camembert is going extinct, is the Camembert de Normandy specification specifically calls out a species of mold called Penicillin candida, which is a synonym for Penicillin camemberti. Depending on the literature you look at, sometimes their naming of microbes gets challenging. But basically, for simplicity's sake, let's just assume that's Penicillin camemberti that has to be used in order to create that rind. So now they're legally bound to this dying species. So, but these specifications change over time. One of the big debates in Camembert de Normandy is whether or not it should be an all raw milk cheese or an all pasteurized cheese or allow a hybrid of it. And this is heavily debated amongst producers, and I have a feeling we're going to see very similar debates about whether or not we specify a specific species of fungi to help age the cheese as well.
Yeah, I was looking at the specification for Brie de Meaux, and although it specifies that the mold should be white, it allows for some what says red streaks or splotches. I didn't see any specific mold strain that was noted in that specification.
Yeah.
But as you mentioned, the whole fact that some of these other similar molds give slightly different colors could still be a problem.
Yeah, exactly. So it's about the pigmentation. But I mean, at some point there's this underlying philosophical debate of like what's the identity of a cheese, and a lot of these PDO, these protected designation of origin cheeses, the reason we have them is to preserve the authenticity and the quality of that tradition. And is it really the region and the practices that are important, or is it the final appearance of the cheese, and how much does the color affect the quality? And I think it's the reason why I started writing about this is because it's a perfect time to kind of readdress those questions. Like is it so necessary that the cheese have such a rigid visual identity, or is the value somewhere else? And I think, for me personally, I think the value is somewhere else.
So, have you tasted cheeses that are, for example, made by natural methods, not using lab-grown penicillium? And if you have, how have they been different from lab-based rinds?
Yeah, I think there's a greater diversity of aroma in those cheeses. For example, they're like I mentioned earthiness earlier. And so when I use that term, it's not always like readily apparent to people what I'm talking about. But these wilder type molds often produce some compounds that are generally considered earthy, right? And so they're kind of like the earthiness of like fresh, healthy soil, forest floor, beets. Right, beets have a lot of these chemical compounds. Fresh rain, and so if you can kind of think about the Venn diagram of overlap of those sensory experiences, that's like a really common aromatic compound called geosmin that is produced by these molds. That has been as they have been domesticated more for the loss of pigmentation, also the loss of those particular aromatic profiles. So if we go back in the evolutionary chain and look at these more wilder color molds, we get more of these earthiness, these soil like notes in them.
Well, now I'm feeling really sorry for the caterers of North America. So many of them depend on having really mild cheeses that don't call attention to themselves to put on cheese plates because people are just, when you go have a cheese plate at a catered party, it's really just there to have something to do with your hands and strategically pause your conversation. It's not they're not supposed to call attention to themselves. So if we have brie that actually has color and flavor and smell, what do these caterers do? I mean, do they have to go for more fresh cheeses? Is it really Strachino's new opportunity, or?
Yeah, I think we'll probably see that. I think we'll probably see more fresh cheeses on these plates. I think we'll also see higher end ones that are these more kind of jumping ahead in the future. These more nostalgic brie and camembert. Their change is inevitable, right at this point. I think we're just starting to kind of like think about like, well, what is that impact?
So, do you think that there's an opportunity here for kind of small natural cheesemakers, artisan cheesemakers to kind of jump ahead and take the lead, or do you think that the culture houses have it well in hand and they're going to have their standard packages out sooner rather than later?
Yeah, I think we're going to see all of it. I mean, I think there's a lot of opportunity here. I think there's opportunity for culture houses to really identify like, hey, we have a strain that isn't come to us for this. I think we're going to see there's a possibility of redomestication that's out there. It's things I've seen in some of the literature. I think, but way outside of the financially feasible at this point is like whether we do gene editing or those kinds of things. But I also think there's going to be a market that's going to be like, we don't want that in our cheese. And so I really think like identifying colonial lineages that are less dependent on that strain are going to be one side of the factor. I think there's going to be lab techniques in order to keep these strains alive that are going to impact the cost. So there's going to be more expensive strains out there, and people are going to want that. And I think there's also an opportunity for people to natural cheesemakers to do that. There's a lot of R&D in it, no matter which way we go. So there's time and expense that are associated with it. I also think there's lots of times that those molds show up in the cheeses, even though we have these strains of camembert that are often totally fine to eat. But it's just because they're so unknown from the people who are buying it that they get tossed.
Yeah.
And I think this is a perfect opportunity to reduce food waste and really start educating ourselves and our consumers about this diversity in cheese rinds.
Well, I would think that there's sort of a first level of education when it comes to cheesemakers themselves with new molds, because not only do they perhaps look different and smell different, but they're going to age the cheese in slightly different ways, and that's going to impact how you and make the cheese, and how you age the cheese, how you store the cheese, and so on.
Yeah, yeah, and particularly on the aging side of things, because so much of our aging protocols and steps that we as being an entrepreneur, someone who ages cheese, the practice and the craft that goes into it is really around this relationship with this very specific species that behaves in this certain manner. And as that changes, the environment that we need to age changes. The levels of humidity, the amount of airflow, the temperature, the amount of time, what we need to do in order to care for it is all going to have to shift.
Let's flash forward 3 to 5 years in the future, and we've kind of settled on some new standards of what these things are supposed to look like, from and how we're supposed to make them, and so on. What should consumers be expecting, and what do you expect to need to do in terms of kind of helping consumers embrace something that looks very different and maybe is a little bit more splotchy or speckled than what they're used to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that work happens at the artisan cheese counters across the country. right? Like it's not there's not going to be a marketing campaign. I doubt there's going to be a marketing campaign that's like embrace more blue molds on your cheese. But
Roasted beef was really, really successful back in the
that's
1980s.
that's
So,
true.
it could happen.
It's true. It's true. But I don't know of any in the works anymore. But I think that work starts at the cheese counter, and right, like having like really passionate, informed cheesemongers that are able to explain what's going on the rind of a cheese, and address concerns. Because the unknown in food can be scary for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say though that artisan cheese counters in the U.S. are pretty few and far between. I mean, I live in the South Bay area in a foodie haven in many ways, and yet I don't know of any independent cheese stores in the South Bay. Right? I mean, if I were to buy cheese, I would go to Italy, I would go to Whole Foods, or I would go to one of our local super high-end supermarket chains. That's it. Two of those three places provide little to no training to the people who work their cheese counters.
Yeah, and that's something internally here at Murray's we spend a lot of time at educating and communicating with our mongers at all of our Murray's cheese counters at the Kroger family of stores across the country, and I think that this is part of that reason is because in order for these artisan cheeses that have this diversity to have a home in the United States, it takes a large group of people.
But there's sort of like this whole rash of folks in the middle who only encounter cheeses in sort of their local supermarket and are used to seeing Brie with a white coat. And at a certain point, they may no longer see Brie with a white coat. And they're the people putting out the Brie don't necessarily know what to expect with Brie not with a white coat. So I foresee a lot of turbulence in the coming years, unless there is a where's the beef type of campaign. I don't know.
Yeah, and the one thing that we don't know, and partly because the papers haven't been published on this, or the research just hasn't been done on this side of it, is like what's the time frame on this change?
Yeah.
And I don't have a good feel for that at all, and I haven't seen really anything written on that or studied along those lines. It's more looking at is this happening and what's the mechanism that's driving it. But like putting a time factor around that gets challenging.
Yep, fair enough. Anything else that we should cover right now?
Wow. We're talking about cheese rinds. I could go on forever.
We can talk about the blue side of things if you want.
Yeah, the blue side of things is really interesting because blue rinded cheeses have a much longer history in production. Like some of the oldest cheeses that we know about had some bluing component to it, and it's just the evolutionary history of that mold was just constructed or kind of like really illuminated in the past 4 or 5 years, and it has these interesting branches. In traditional production for Roquefort, the rye bread grows the Penicillium roqueforti, and the rye bread is placed into the cave with the cheeses, and so you have this mechanism of maintaining this cycle of life for this particular mold to age these cheeses over time. And in doing so, that particular strain got selected for its ability to grow on rye bread just as much as its ability to grow in cheese. And so there is a hardiness factor in that particular strain, whereas when it gets isolated and starts getting developed in culture houses for a lot of the other blue cheeses, that kind of evolutionary fitness was not so much of a factor, and that's the one that is having the problems on reproducibility in the lab. And so there's this indication of our production methods have a huge impact on the longevity of the products that we produce, which is something I don't think we've really talked about. And here's some very concrete evidence that the way we produce the foods that we love and the relationships that we enter into these microbes are just intimately entangled.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. That's probably a great place to stop.
Okay.
Josh, where can people find you if they want to follow your thoughts and learn more from you?
Yeah, so I'm the caves manager for Murray's Cheese. So I can be found on murrayscheese.com and at the Murray's Cheese Instagram account, talking a lot about cheese. And then I run my own Instagram account called The Offenor, with pictures of cheese rinds and little
And
micro
lovely
essays.
essays.
Thank you.
Yes, you're a great writer. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope that folks will get more comfortable with a wider variety of molds going forward, having heard your thoughts on the matter. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining this episode of Into the Curdverse. Next time, we'll be discussing salt, its role in cheesemaking, and taking an in-depth look at brined and heavily salted cheeses of the Eastern Mediterranean. In the meantime, if you've been enjoying this podcast, please give us a rating or review in your favorite podcast app. It helps others find the podcast. And then join us again next time as we once again enter the Curdverse.